Hey everyone, I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's case study. Super excited as always. And today I've got Rob Phillips, a fellow Seattleite here. He's the head of school at Seattle Academy. And of course, Rob and I are talking like on a typical gray, wet April day. It should be nice, but it's not. But Rob, thanks for stopping by today, and I really appreciate it.
Yep, happy to be here.
Great. Hey, Rob, before we dig in, because we've got a lot to talk about, especially around like entrepreneurial thinking and running and managing schools, talk a little bit about yourself and, of course, introduce Seattle Academy.
Yeah, so ironically, this is my, I think, 34th year at Seattle Academy. So those two topics tend to intertwine a lot because I've been here such a crazy amount of time. Head of school, have been head or associate head in some combination going on about 15 years, but for a long time. I've taught English and history, always had a lot of interest in entrepreneurship and economics, so I've taught those courses too. Longtime coach, and spent most of my summers leading wilderness trips, which loved doing at the time and had a little appreciation then for how helpful that would be in leading a school in terms of thinking back to some of those, kind of really interesting complicating situations you end up in the middle of the tundra of Alaska or sea kayaking somewhere. Seattle Academy, we tend to go by SAS. The acronym is Seattle Academy of the Arts and Sciences. Almost nobody knows what that stands for or even remembers or cares, but we're just kind of known as SAS in the marketplace. And probably come up later in the conversation, Peter, but I actually used to hate that acronym and resisted it for a long time. I just thought, SAS, what is that? But, realized at a certain point, that's how people know us. That's how it's working. And so let's just kind of embrace it and roll with that. The school was founded in 1983. It was actually founded in kind of a philosophic and governance dispute within an existing school. And essentially there was disagreement between the founders and the board. The board decided they needed to leave and start a new school. That was in the middle of August, and they had a new school up and running by the middle of October. And so that kind of entrepreneurial mindset of, hey, let's figure out a way, is pretty wired in. I think they started off with about 75 kids. I think it was mostly just a high school then. When I came in the fall of 91, it was about 110 kids, grades 6 through 12, and the school is now, will open up in the fall of 24 with more than 1,200 kids going into the fall. So significant growth over that period of time.
Yeah, 40 years from 75 to 1,200. That's hard, right? So like how, I'm just thinking, because I talk to schools all over the country and, growth could mean 20 kids, right? But yet you're like growing exponentially, it seems every 5 years or whatever the cadence may be. Like, how does that work, especially under your leadership? Like, what was the vision behind it to get to 1,230? And how, I'm just curious.
Well, I think you have to, for those not in the Seattle market, have to appreciate, we all have to appreciate how much right place, right time. Somebody's going to write a great book about the tracking the impact of Microsoft and Microsoft families with the rise of independent schools in Seattle and ability to build campuses. So, you had this influx of workers who valued education, entrepreneurs who made a lot and wanted to invest in the community. So that was a part of it for sure. SAS is located, I should have mentioned this, we're right in the middle of downtown Seattle. We're on Capitol Hill. So it's a little bit of a different neighborhood than downtown per se, but we are in the thick of it. Our location was not seen as an asset in the early 80s. This wasn't an awesome neighborhood for a school. As the city has kind of grown up around us and, again, the Microsofts and Amazons and everything else, we're kind of in a great spot, right? We can draw geographically from all directions and many of our other peer schools are farther north or east. I think a piece that benefited the school early, frankly, is in those early days, mentor who I taught and coached with for a long time, and he used to say the key is to coach the team you have, not the team you wish you had. And we had the kids we had, and we had to figure out how to identify their strengths, not get too wrapped around the axle on their challenges, and leverage those strengths over time. I don't know that that was necessarily the full-on intent of the school, but once you really started to say, wow, these are some brilliant, awesome, interesting, complicated kids who, frankly, most other independent schools don't want or don't know what to do with. Um, and so I think that sense of you really have to get to know every kid and figure out how to support them started to develop as part of the mainstream part of the philosophy of the school. And then one of the places that took the school is, early on, the arts program was probably central to the school's identity and that emphasis on creativity. And where a few of us came in and said, that's awesome. What about the kids who love athletics? What about the kids who love outdoors? What about the kids who want to start a business? What about the kids who love robotics? Those areas weren't inherently spaces that the school was inclined to focus on. But the leadership of the school said, from a mission and values point, we should care about those as much. We should invest in those as much. And, from an enrollment strategic point, yeah, the broader the range. And what that's evolved into is I would say, people here get really tired of hearing it because I say it all the time. But if you have 3 kids, we are the school who will understand, value, and support all 3 of your kids. And frankly, most independent schools are going to take one of your kids, we're going to waitlist the second, and they're going to decline the third. And I don't say that necessarily as a criticism as much as they're probably engineered for a very particular type of learner. And what we have done over time is built and delivered on a broad definition of human talent and potential, which translates to a broad program and a broad admissions funnel.
Yeah. So what I'm really curious to hear you articulate is the vision, because the vision, I think, ultimately is going to fuel a lot of the entrepreneurial stuff that we're going to talk about today. So when you're looking out and you're saying the vision for SAS is, like, how do you fill in that blank?
Yeah, and I'll point it back in the other direction. I think back all the time to kids I taught about 25 years ago or 20 years ago who we didn't serve as well as we could have. And I think, okay, what would this kid have needed either in my skill set as a teacher or in our approach as a school or even the programs that we provide that would have given that kid a place to be successful and to develop close relationships with trusting adults that would have given them a chance to succeed instead of flail. And so that question is always, so for example, I had no appreciation of robotics as an activity, much less as a team sport. And the point at which I saw the kids fully engaged in the robotics program, who were the kids who wanted to fabricate metal and build them, and I saw them working with the gamers who wanted to control the robot in the ring, and I saw them working with the kids who wanted to dig into the CAD software and do the programming, and then realize there's a whole group of kids here who are going to engage together in a team sport in a way that 20 years ago probably wasn't going to happen. And then what does that mean for their capacity in the workforce, given that they've got something they love and are good at, but they've also had to learn to work in a collaborative team in real-time action? So that's kind of the question all the time of, okay, we see a bunch of kids we're serving really well. All schools are pretty quick to put those kids out in front. Who are the kids that we're not? And rather than say, well, we just can't, like, what would it take?
How do you lean into their talents? Like, that's what I mean, like rhetorically, right? Like, is that one of the questions you ask? Like, how do you create scenarios where they can be successful?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, part of it is thinking about the range of, that is often going to come in the form of what some schools think of as extracurriculars. But for so many kids, that's going to come in the performing arts, visual arts, athletics, robotics, speech and debate, wilderness trips, that I think schools have maybe tended to see as extras and we see as intrinsic. We probably lead with those to a fault sometimes, because I think, for some in the market, they go, wow, that's what you really care about, not the academic program. Or we're not as good as we need to be at articulating how those are game changers for kids in the classroom. But to a large extent, we'll focus heavily on what are those areas of strength, or, in other cases, for some kids, it's creative writing, it's lab science.
Sure. Sure. But your strategy is to create places where kids with all talents, abilities, interests, what have you, they can feel seen and heard, and they can, lean into those things. Like you're creating those
They need to be
experiences.
successful. In kid world, you need to be visibly successful, which is the benefit of some of those
Yeah.
activities. Because if you're good at something but nobody knows you're good at it, that's not great when you're 14.
Right.
And then that
Right.
leads to a mindset, not only of a growth mindset about kids, but then institutionally realizing, okay, the ability to grow is going to give us the economic capacity to offer more programs and at a higher, both at the entry level and at the higher level, um, to activate on that.
It's I talk about this a lot, so like no surprise, I'm not going to go in super detail on this, but the independent school business model is under stress, right? I've spoken with over 100 heads. I've had dinner with you. We've talked about it. Like, it's just, I don't need to go there. But what strikes me is that even though there's this kind of pervasive view that this is a stress model, we still lean into a playbook that we've largely been leveraging for a lot of years, right? Hoping that maybe this year things will switch and we'll start to see success in a different direction. What strikes me about what you're doing is that you feel like you're playing a different game in a lot of ways. And that game is tied into this entrepreneurial like DNA that started with 75 kids and is now going to open in over 1,200 next year. Like how my question was like, how did you inject that? But it was already there. I guess the question, the rephrased question would be like, how have you built on that? Like, what does that look like for you as a leader trying to carve out SaaS's position in the market?
Yeah. Tell me if this is too tangential, but I've been thinking a lot. Our conversation in the fall got me thinking about this in part because, so many in education and even on the business side of education use similar terms, but people mean such different things by them. I think that's part of the problem. And I've been thinking about the idea of the market and the marketplace, not just in a broad economic sense, but almost in a medieval sense. Communities have had these marketplaces where trade routes converge, river systems converge, Roman road together, and there's an economic marketplace that happens for natural reasons there. But there's also the marketplace of ideas. And what's interesting is if you get a bunch of educators in a room, they're probably pretty uncomfortable talking about the economic marketplace. And that's probably a stress point between them and their boards. Or they can talk about marketing, but they don't really understand the relationship between marketing and the actual marketplace you're in conversation with. But if you ask a bunch of educators about the marketplace of ideas, and that's what a school is, it gets super psyched about that.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, we are in all of those marketplaces as a school if we're successful all the time. We're a marketplace of ideas, which is why, at SaaS, we hold these big summit events where, we tackle issues like the coming election, education reform, generative AI, entrepreneurship in the social sphere. And
these are
700,
like
800 people open to the
right?
public. We bring our alumni back who are engaged in those areas. Our parents are engaged. And on the kind of curricular educational end, people are psyched about it because we are engaged in the marketplace of ideas in a leadership and generative way that is what schools should supposed to do. And at the same time, the market, the education market, is paying attention. And parents who are engaged in the market of what are your programs, but what do you care about? And what's the public role you're playing? And so I think we've always kind of intuitively said, just like you set up the medieval marketplace at the convergent point, we're trying to think about what is the convergence between the marketplace of ideas and our place in the broader independent school market and linking those all the time. And I just don't think independent. This is what you and I your stuff is. The conversations you're leading nationally are great because you're telling educators you have to pay attention to the marketplace per se, but you can't abandon your leadership role in the marketplace of ideas. And then your school's probably got to have some key positions on things, So we put out a position paper on generative AI a long time ago, which we continue to change weekly, but you're engaged in that marketplace of ideas constantly.
Right. Well, your entrepreneurial summit that you did in the fall, right? I mean, yeah, it's funny. Maybe I took it for granted when I saw that you did that. I just like, oh, that's a cool idea. I didn't, and now I'm kind of kicking myself. I did not take the next step in understanding the strategy behind it, which is like, there's a public-private purpose in that, right? Like you're giving back to the community and establishing connections beyond, the city block that SAS lives on, and creating, inroads into all of these different places so that you're not only benefiting your students, but ultimately you're giving back to the community, which is such an important part of any independent school strategy.
We brought in partners from, charter schools in Seattle, public charter schools, and invited them in and facilitated their participation. We brought in, we worked with Rainer Scholars to make it open to that community. And at the same time, we held it right in the middle of the fall admissions season. And we talked about it at every open house, and we invited every applicant to say, hey, if you want to see what we care about and what role we want to play in a community and what issues we think our kids should be thinking about to be ready for, come to this.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes, I usually pride myself on like being able to pick apart strategy. I completely missed that. But
right.
I understood.
Right.
I understood the value of it as a consumer, right? As somebody who's, in the marketplace and looking for a place where, the ideas resonate. Hey, I'm curious. So, when we first spoke this summer, I was at the front end of talking to heads of school. Probably had talked to a couple dozen at that point. It's now well over 100 that I've spoken with. And one of the questions that I typically ask is, the head, who, by the way, that person is managing an operating budget of 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, $100 million, like big organizations. I ask, like, do you receive any kind of business or entrepreneurial training ahead of sitting in that seat? And I mean, aside from like 3 or 4, the answer is they just didn't get it. Not because they didn't want it, not because the system was trying to prohibit them from accessing it. This wasn't built into the pipeline, at least, broadly anyway. So, like, you're running an organization. What did you say, 12 something in the fall? I mean, that's pretty significant growth over just even the last 3 or 4 years, if I'm not mistaken. What do you look for in terms of or what do you try to instill in your team from an entrepreneurial point of view? Like, what are the skills that you think are really important outside of the skills that they have in their respective domains? Like, I'm trying to articulate that for folks so that they can start to think about, maybe I need to pick up this.
I think one of the first tragedies is we've got brilliant parents and alumni in all of our school communities who have an understanding of the world, whether it's about entrepreneurship or generative AI or talent recruitment or retention, that exceeds what most of us in education have. And I think a lot of heads are frankly uncomfortable with I would challenge anybody and say, do one coffee a week with a parent who's brilliant in that area and just start talking to them and start asking them questions. And I think it's hard for, especially in leadership, for heads. It's a moment of vulnerability to really be in that conversation, and because they're going to go into a finance committee meeting and they kind of want to pretend like they know what everybody's talking about, but they probably don't. And so to start to have those one-on-one conversations, but I think skillful, carefully done, just ask a lot of questions to say, hey, as an entrepreneur, what should I be thinking about as my organization grows or changes, or as somebody who is living hiring in the tech world? What do you think the implications for me for faculty hiring? I think there is a huge opportunity. And, it's kind of like when you tell head school can appreciate this. Everybody says they're going to go visit lots of classes every year. It typically doesn't happen and just kind of gets swallowed up in the run. This is one of those things that I hear heads or aspiring heads say, I'm going to start talking to those people with a core competency in the marketplace in an area that matters for my school. we probably don't know as much about as we should, or I personally don't. But I think there's huge untapped value there.
Yeah. What about for your team? Like, how are they how are you setting them up to
Yeah.
acquire skills that are just important to SaaS in general? Is it just you've set up structures so they're just inherently like picking them up, or are there actually like
Yeah,
explicit
well,
things
it's
that
kind
you
of
do?
cheating, right? Because you've had a school with an entrepreneurial lean for so long that the way I think about hiring is very
Yeah,
different than probably
exactly.
most of my peers
Yeah.
do. And I mean, I'm hiring for an entrepreneurial
Yeah, we'll
mindset.
break into that. Yeah.
And you want to balance. You don't. You can't, if you had all of that, that would be tricky. But and we're hiring people outside of for teaching and leadership roles outside of education from other entrepreneurial organizations for sure. I was lucky to have the head of school who was the founding head at SAS, who really built that foundation that we're still working off of, who had been a head of school and a division head, but who decided to get her graduate degree as an MBA. And so she said to me early on, don't get a master's in education, get an MBA. You can always hire lots of people in a school with that next level curricular expertise. But for your own growth, get that MBA. And so I've actually sent members of my leadership team on the academic program side, where we've encouraged and supported their post-grad work. We've actually sent them in entrepreneurial and kind of traditional business directions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What are some of the returns that you see on that, just from as a leadership from a leadership point of view?
Understanding realities of budget, resource allocation, understanding that there are revenue generators in your school, and they're indirect maybe in program, but there's a difference between the kind of skills and mindset to go into the direct revenue generation areas of the school. Those are kind of direct and immediate. I think the other benefit is that, let's face it, most educators don't really have a clue of what our graduates are going to need to be able to do. We like schools so much we stayed. And so when you engage a little bit outside of the world of education, you have a much better visceral sense of what our graduates need to do. And I think you also have a better direct sense in admissions and marketing of what parents are thinking about and worrying about for their kids in the marketplaces that they're going to have to be successful and competitive in.
How, you've got a big portfolio, right? You've got a large school that you're running. I mean, and you're managing a big construction project too. I mean, just a lot. How much of your time do you focus on things like enrollment? Like, is that a big part of your domain, or do you have more a little hands-off approach to that?
Direct. It's a major revenue generator. More important than that, as a leader, I believe that the most important places of impact are who you bring into your community. Enrollment, hiring. And then you've got to be great on the finance side. You can't abdicate that to your finance chair. And you've got to be great in fundraising, whether you're more strategic or whether you're engaged directly, because those are lifebloods for all of the things that we care about. And I just don't think it's strategic or responsible to kind of feel like, I'm not really comfortable with that. I'm going to pay somebody else to do that stuff.
You just said that the welcoming students and welcoming faculty, right? Like we spend a lot of time, and this isn't my idea, right? This is like Julie Falstich, who is a former head, Greg Martin at Vermont Academy. We spend a lot of time dedicating energy towards enrollment management, like thinking holistically around like how is that student not only going to enter the school, but the experience that they have throughout, right? Putting that kind of, thinking about like, how do we adopt a similar type of mindset model for faculty, like a talent development model, right? That is akin to enrollment management, but really does think about the employee experience first, as a major driver to success for the school.
Well, I think one of the inherent advantages of growth is, so, part of this is, I think some of the things we're talking about, you either want to be big or small, not in between, if you can control that. But think about the potential given the vast number of electives that we're able to offer as a school, of what that means to work to the strength of your faculty in a particular area versus you're a generalist all of the time. You think about in a, high school of 800 plus versus the 800 or the 400 that we were, maybe 15 years ago, the opportunities for internal advancement. And we're big on that. I'm the third head at SAS in 43 years, and we've done internal succession every step of the way. And we're always looking at that. How do you grow your own talent? And then typically bring external perspectives in at that kind of middle to upper, but always thinking about that internal talent management. So, you got faculty here who are getting a chance to do more of what they're great at, some flexibility to maybe take a couple of years and bring somebody in and say, I think they could be pretty strong. Let's kind of wait and see where their real strengths are. And so you can play to that a little bit more. And then our faculty here are always seeing opportunities for internal advancement and growth. It doesn't mean that they're the ones who are going to get it, but they see their peers. And so I think those are pretty significant factors.
Hey, so as we wrap up here, let me throw a scenario out at you. Like, imagine a school head calls you and says, I'm watching what you're doing. I'm seeing your growth. I'm picking up the vibe that you guys have an entrepreneurial DNA that's really driving a lot of this success. I want to do that too. And and so then the question would be, where do I start? Like, what kind of advice would you offer a head who's maybe doesn't have that kind of baked into their DNA of their school?
I would say figure out whatever you have to do move your budget around, get creative in your hiring, but start hiring as many learning support people as you can. And if they get kids and can make strong relationships with kids and the technical piece isn't there, but they can get that later. We want to serve the widest possible range of kids and learners. We believe that that's the modern workforce. We believe that there are talents and potential in kids that most independent schools at best disregard. And what that means is we have the widest possible admissions funnel. I was talking with a parent the other day about a kid who left a peer school, came to us and said, we struggled to get accommodations for our kid at the other independent school. We love that you accommodate our kid. I'd stop him and say, no, we value your kid. Of course your kid has accommodations, and of course we support those accommodations on a kind of legal, moral, practical level. But what we do is we value your kids and the accommodations they receive are as part of their learning profile. Of course we do that. And there are lots of schools that won't give kids accommodations, or they give them, I accommodate going to work with a cough, I mean, you accommodate something you don't really want to have to deal with, but you have to accommodate. There are so many kids who would love to be in independent schools, who independent schools could serve well, and they choose not to, or do so reluctantly or half-heartedly. And, part of this, Peter, is our admissions funnel. Then when you get to the marketplace, you look out in the marketplace and say, well, why are people choosing to pay private school tuition instead of sending their kid to their public school? It may be an outdated sense of, because they want to get into an IB and they think you're going to help them do it. I would argue the likelier scenario is their kid needs support to maximize their potential in a way that other schools aren't meeting. And the marketplace is telling you, here's all these kids who are awesome. Let's figure that out. And so I would say to schools, staff for that. And not just for the donor kids, staff for that.
With that advice, thank you, Rob Phillips. Hey, if somebody's vibing with this and wants to follow up, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Email me at rphillips@clacademy.org, and you can say that's great, and you can say you're absolutely crazy, and that will fit in with the kind of emails that, especially the latter, that are coming into my email box all the time of dude, what are you talking about?
Well, look, I think like I said earlier, the independent schools have really focused on this playbook that had a lot of success for a long time, but it's getting stressed. And now we've got to figure out like what are different ways, which is why I talked to you. I talked to Amy Jolly at Applewild School, Kevin Folan at Province Country Day, like folks that are trying to different approaches and having success. So Rob Phillips, head of school, SAS. Sorry, I was about to say Seattle Academy, SAS. Thank you for my time, my friend. This has been terrific.
So thanks, Peter. Keep doing the good work, man. Thanks.